This is section 1 of the Fight for Equal Rights. We just finished up going through our civil rights movement notes, so this goes along pretty well with that section. We'll talk about some women's rights. We'll talk about the counterculture a little bit, some just more cultural things of the 1960s. And we'll look at some Mexican American rights and Native American rights and just other things that kind of went along with the civil rights movement. Okay, the counterculture. Counterculture is rooted in the social and political events of the 1950s. If you remember when we were going over the 1950s not too long ago, we talked about the beats, or the beatniks. And I kind of told you, I think, these are kind of the forefathers, if you will, of the hippies. So the beat movement, if you don't remember, emphasized freedom from materialism, of being proud of who you are as an individual, of not, going along with the mainstream. And then the civil rights movement pops up and it introduces this new idea of social and political protest, and it's all televised. And I've told you before, remember, the Vietnam War is going on the entire time that these things are going on as well, because you have to remember, we're not doing this class chronologically, it's kind of topically, so try to keep all that in mind. The 60s has a lot of different layers and aspects to it. Both movements prompted many people to question traditional boundaries and heighten the distrust of authority, leading some in the counterculture to declare to not trust anyone over 30. 30 was kind of seen as, you're an adult now. Members of the counterculture valued youth, spontaneity, freedom of expression, and what you guys would know them as would be hippies. These young people promoted peace, love, freedom, experimented with new styles of dress, music, freer attitudes towards sexual relationships, and the recreational use of drugs. Their values were so different from their parents that many social analysts would describe the situation as a generation gap. And I think that's a really good phrase, and I think that you would agree that there's been a generation gap between children and their parents for decades and decades, and I think you would agree that one exists now. I mean, probably not too many of you love the same exact things that your parents love, so it's a common thing, and access to media, access to a wider variety of music and different things like that, and being able to see how other people in the country and the world live, I think has increased the likelihood of that gap existing, and maybe the gap itself. The baby boom that followed World War II resulted in a huge student population in the 60s, so by sheer numbers, the baby boomers, became a force for social change, because there was just so many of them, and so many clothing and music, and television were geared towards them because they were a large consumer group as well. By the 1960s, rock and roll would become a defining characteristic. Introduced that in the 1950s. We talked about, the first ones to really get the music on the scene with Elvis, but it is really the Beatles that make rock and roll, incredibly popular. I don't think any of you have not heard of the Beatles. They're one of the most famous groups, people, bands, fill in the blank, in the entire world. More than 70 million Americans watched them on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964. When they come to the United States, this is kind of the kickoff of the British invasion. We're going to watch some stuff about that. The Beatles also had an impact on folk musicians like Bob Dylan, who sang a song about protest, and highlighting civil rights and peace movements and war and all of the things like that are going on in the 60s. Art and literature of the 60s and 70s also displayed a rebellious side, with Andy Warhol's realistic paintings of common items, such as the Campbell soup cans, which you've seen, I'm sure. It was kind of a satire look at what's real and what's not real. Members of the counterculture rejected many of the traditional restrictions on sexual behavior, kind of talked about that, or introduced it on the first slide, in what became known as the sexual revolution. They called for separation of sex from traditional family life, meaning they did not believe that sex had to be kept or saved necessarily for the confines of marriage. For example, many hippies lived together in communes or small communities in which people have common interests. Sexual revolution was one of the strongest indicators of that generation gap that we talked about. A poll showed that nearly 2/3 of Americans over the age of 30 opposed premarital sex, whereas a majority of those under the age of 29 did not. Eventually, the sexual revolution led to a more open discussion of sex in the mainstream media. Part of the reason the sexual revolution was possible in this year was birth control was more accessible with the birth control pill coming out. In 1967, as many as 2,000 people flocked to Haight-Ashbury, which is kind of a neighborhood in San Francisco, became the center of the counterculture. Hippies there experimented with drugs, wore unconventional clothing, listened to rock music, speeches from different political radicals like Timothy Leary. He had been a Harvard professor and researcher at one time, but he encouraged Americans, or the youth of America that were there listening to him, to experiment with drugs and free their mind and think about things kind of in a different way. The hippies of San Francisco attracted a great deal of media attention. Most of it was critical to the lifestyles they advocated. Life in Haight-Ashbury did prove to have unwanted effects, experienced high levels of drug abuse, and increased numbers of crime. Some members of the counterculture sought spiritual enlightenment outside of the Judeo-Christian traditions in which they had been raised, so exploring Buddhism and other Eastern religions, while others sought spirituality by living in harmony with nature. So there's more than one way, is what I'm trying to get you to see here, to be a part of the counterculture. Lots of different avenues you can take. By the end of the 1960s, many people, even those within the counterculture, have become pretty disillusioned to it. Many of them found it not to be a very sustainable lifestyle. The utopian urge to discover a more authentic way of living had an unfortunate underside. We talked about the drug addictions in Haight-Ashbury and crime, but those things could also have negative effects like overdoses and deaths from other things. A number of rock musicians, most famously Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, which you've probably heard of both of them. We actually saw a video of Jimi Hendrix, showed you something just the other day that he was in, talking about his national anthem performance that he did at Woodstock. And then Janis is above him. They died from drug overdoses, and they were in their 20s, and they were incredibly talented. So when the news came out, it shocked a lot of people. At the same time, the movement's values were becoming increasingly shallow and self-centered. The counterculture fell apart. Most hippies abandoned their social experiment, melted right back into the mainstream. Still, the seeds of protest they had sown would influence the growing rights revolution. Right, that was the end of section 1. Here's your questions. Make sure that you get those done in your notes, and we will move on to section 2.